Percy William Savage was born above the cells of Acton Police Station around 1878, 10 years after his father, Frederick William Richard Savage, joined the police force. His father, who he admired, would become the first detective inspector in personal attendance to Queen Victoria in 1882, a position he held for 11 years before retiring from the Met in 1893. The position he held saw the family move to Windsor, where Percy's father now had an office connected to the palace. It was his duty to accompany the Queen wherever she went, and when not at Windsor he would be in attendance at Balmoral or Osborne. He rarely spoke about the royals, but did mention he had helped on more than one occasion the well-known John Brown in assisting the Queen. Percy Savage joined the force on 8th of January 1900, a young man keen to serve as honourable as his father had just a few years earlier. In the early days he earned 23 shillings and sixpence. Back then police stations didn't have any form of telecommunications. If you needed a policeman you had to physically go out and find one. In the past many stations could only communicate with each other using a telegraph needle instrument. To travel around his area, the superintendent relied on a horse and trap provided by the force. Percy's training consisted of spending 3 weeks in a section house, and during that time they attended military drill at Wellington Barracks and visited police courts in order to glean some knowledge of criminal law and police procedure. They were then considered to be fully fledged policemen and were turned out onto the streets for duty with a copy of Sir Howard Vincent's police code in their pockets. Once he had his uniform he was posted to Bethnal Green Division. Right from the start his ability to spot a criminal was impressive, managing to collar one of the most prolific pickpockets the Met had been looking for some time. At the Old Bailey the criminal was sentenced to 5 years penal servitude. On his days off, Percy would often roam the streets of London alongside Detective Sergeant Handley, who, in Percy's opinion, was one of the most accomplished apprehenders of thieves he had ever come across. Handley apparently had a marvellous memory for faces and names, and had a positive genius for spotting pickpockets and burglars. They all appeared to be on very good terms with him, and gave Percy some advice, telling him, "If you treat them decently," he said, "they are all right. Their job," he added, "is to commit crime, and our job is to catch 'em. And they understand that. It's funny, but most of them will be straight with you if you're straight with them." But after a couple of months Percy found himself taken off the streets and behind a desk, a part of the job he hated, sitting in an office labouring lost items that had been left on public transport. But he kept his walks with Handley on his days off, and even helped him on a couple of occasions raid some illegal gaming houses. As he continued his mundane job in Lost and Found, his life was soon to change. Detective Inspector Henry Collins, who was in charge of the CID at Bethnal Green, sent for him. In Percy's words, the conversation went something like this. "Hello, Sonny, what are you doing?" Collins asked. Percy replied, "Lost Property Office, receiving sticks and umbrellas." "Soft job that, like it?" he asked. "Not much," Percy replied. "Well, would you like to join the department and be a real detective?" "I know all about what you did at the raid the other day," said the inspector, "and I was very pleased. Nobody takes you for a copper, and you can catch thieves very easily." And so it came about that in April 1901 a very happy Percy Savage was posted as a constable to the Bethnal Green Division of the Criminal Investigation Department. Percy was the first CID officer to be officially employed as a shorthand writer, a learned subject his father had told him would be useful in the force. And in this capacity, as a detective officer, he took notes at trials, inquests and public meetings. He was also engaged to take notes on complicated cases of fraud which were dealt with in the division. He sat in on important case interviews where he recorded in writing what was said. In this way, Percy acquired a knowledge of criminal law. But it was his days off that gained him the knowledge of the criminals' hangouts and tricks of their trade. Hanley, mostly aimed at pickpockets, showed him the areas that pickpockets like to hang out, which is common sense really. Any large gathering of people, you would find some. He learned what to look out for and became familiar with faces. He watched as young boys tapped ladies' purses to see if they contained money. If it did, they would signal their partner, who would run by and take what they could from the lady's purse that they carried in their pockets. Savage learned so much from Hanley, but Percy Savage had a stronger desire to apprehend the individuals who taught young ones to steal, rather than the young ones themselves. These individuals were commonly known as thief trainers. Savage successfully carried out his duties because his appearance didn't resemble that of a typical police officer, a fact that was often remarked on by his superiors. Percy Savage's work was tough, long hours and lengthy days of investigations, standing for hours and days, waiting and watching, catching some of the most ruthless and cruelest of men. By 1903, Percy Savage had not only married, but had rapidly risen in rank to detective sergeant, a man relentless in his duties to the force and respected by his colleagues at New Scotland Yard. Here's just a few cases Percy Savage worked on. Edgar Edwards triple murder. 2 days before Christmas 1902, when Savage was still a detective constable at Bethnal Green, a coal carter, a man delivering sacks of coal, was driving down a quiet thoroughfare in Leighton, known as Church Road, when he heard the sound of breaking glass. He glanced towards the small villa he was passing and saw that the glass panel in the front door had been smashed and a blood-stained hand was dangling through the jagged hole. The hand waved feebly up and down for a second and then disappeared. The driver jumped off his car, opened the iron gate and ran to the front door. He heard groans and cries of "Murder! Murder!" coming from inside the house. Thrusting his hand through the broken panel, he opened the door by pulling the latch. Lying on the floor of the narrow hall was an elderly man whose head was badly injured. He tried to murmur something, moved his hand as though to point upstairs, and then relapsed into unconsciousness. The coalman shouted for help. Neighbours and passers-by came running up, and in a minute or so a policeman arrived. He was just in time to see a man scampering through the back garden and seized him as he was about to leap over a hedge. A doctor attended to the injured man, who was then sent to West Ham Hospital, while the policeman escorted his prisoner to Leighton Police Station. Inspector Collins read the message and handed it to Savage, telling him it looked like attempted murder and to get straight on it. Sergeant Burgess went with him. When he and Burgess arrived at the station, they saw the prisoner in the charge room. He said his name was Edgar Edwards. He was tall and powerfully built, with dark hair and a heavy moustache. When he spoke, his voice was quiet and well controlled, but there was a curious expression in his dark eyes and a smile that looked almost leeringly at Savage. As he watched him trying to analyse his character, he had no idea what was about to unfold. The young uniformed policeman briefly gave the facts to Savage. He said the injured man's name was John Garland, and Edwards was said to have struck him on the head with a sash-weight, which had been wrapped in white paper and tied round with red tape. The sash-weight had been picked up in the house. Edwards listened to this calmly before standing up and claiming that during a dispute about a boxing match, Garland had become violent and Edwards had struck him in self-defence, causing him to fall and injure his head on the stairs. Savage thought the whole story odd. Why would a man of Edwards' stature need a tool to down the smaller man? And Edwards didn't have a scratch on him apart from the wound on the back of his head. Edwards went quiet when asked about himself. All he would say was that he had occupied the house in Church Road for more than 2 or 3 weeks, and that Garland had come round on business. On searching his pockets, they discovered a visiting card with the name Mr. William John Darby, grocer, Wyndham Road, Camberwell. They also found a number of pawn tickets related to articles of jewellery pledged in the name of Darby. They went to Church Road but found little help from them. They then went to the grocer's on Wyndham Road but found the place closed. When talking to the neighbours, they learned that the previous owners had left with their baby girl about a month before, but they didn't know where they had gone, and the new owner had cleared the place of any furniture before leaving the place locked up. Now the mystery was, who and where was Darby? Inquiries revealed that Mrs. Darby had a sister, Mrs. Elizabeth Baldwin, who lived at Catford, a shrewd, intelligent woman, and she knew something was very wrong. Elizabeth Baldwin told them. "I am certain something dreadful has happened," she said. "Towards the end of November I had a letter from my sister asking me to go over to Camberwell to see the baby. I went to the shop in Wyndham Road on December the 3rd, and to my surprise I saw a hunchback man serving behind the counter. I asked for my sister, and he told me that Mr. and Mrs. Darby had left 2 days before, after selling the business and the furniture to a man named Edgar Edwards. I could not believe it, but shortly afterwards Edwards himself came in. He seemed a most pleasant man, and he assured me that Mr. and Mrs. Darby had gone away with their child and was staying with some friends, but he didn't know where. All I could do was to return home, wondering what had really happened, and hoping that my sister would write to me, but no letter came. She was shocked and thought it strange as to why her sister would invite her to visit when they were going to move. She couldn't understand what had happened for them to have moved so quickly without mentioning it to her. She knew something was wrong, as her sister would have definitely been in touch. Savage and Burgess also found it strange. The detectives decided to take Mrs. Baldwin to the house on Church Road. She walked around from room to room, exclaiming all the furniture had belonged to her sister. When she saw some clothing, she cried out loud, "Those are my sister's. She would have taken them with her." She was very distressed. With tears falling down her face, she whispered to Savage that she believed they had been murdered, and looking out of the window she claimed they were all buried in the garden. She was sure of it. As soon as they had the go-ahead from their superior, they and a handful of officers began to dig. For an hour or so they worked with their spades, and when halfway down the garden and near a corrugated iron fence, they unearthed at a depth of nearly 5 feet 6 sacks containing the mutilated remains of Mr. Darby and his wife and the body of their child. Savage returned to the shop in Wyndham Road. The whole place had been stripped of stock and furniture. On the bare walls of one of the bedrooms upstairs and on the landing there were bloodstains. Lying on the floor was a sash weight, and on it was found a single hair, which was afterwards identified as being torn from Mr. Darby's head. There was absolutely no doubt now that the Darbys had lost their lives in that shop, and their bodies had been taken away and buried in the garden. After piecing together all of the statements, they had all the details they needed. William John Darby was 26 years of age, and for about 12 months he carried on the business of a grocer in a small shop in Wyndham Road. He was assisted by his wife, who was 28. Their only child, Beatrice, was 3 months old. Unfortunately, the business was not a success, and he advertised it for sale, the purchase price being £50. Edgar Edwards negotiated for its purchase, and on November the 26th he had so far proceeded with his plot that he told a woman named Sarah Summers, with whom he had been long acquainted, that he intended to buy a grocer's shop and the furniture in the house. 2 days later he called on a friend named James Goodwin. He was a hunchback and lived at Walworth, within a short distance of Wyndham Road. He told the hunchback and Mrs. Goodwin that he was going to do them a good turn by giving them the management of a shop he had just bought. This offer came as a pleasant surprise to the Goodwins, and they readily accepted it. Then Edwards made a strange request. He asked the hunchback to purchase a sash weight for him, claiming he wanted it for opening and closing the door of the shop. Goodwin bought the sash and handed it to Edwards. Edwards slept at Goodwin's house on November the 30th and left after breakfast on the following morning, December the 1st. He then had no money in his pocket and was driven to asking Goodwin to pawn an umbrella for him for 1 shilling and 6pence. He put his money and the sashway in his pocket and left for Windham Road. It was deduced that Edwards had committed the murders between 11 and 12 o'clock. At 12 o'clock on December the 1st, he met the Goodwins in Windham Road and took them back to the shop, and at 1:50 the shop was reopened. The Goodwins started the job of serving customers. He and his wife were warned by Edwards that they must not on no account go upstairs, and so they didn't. It was deduced that Edwards and Darby had gone upstairs to discuss the sale. While there, Edwards hit Darby over the head with a sash weight. Mrs. Darby heard the commotion and went to see what had happened. He killed her and then went to the child. Edwards then pawned Darby's gold watch and chain for £7 10s, gave the Goodwins 30 shillings, and even redeemed the umbrella he had pawned that same morning. On December the 3rd he secured a tenancy of Church Road. On December the 5th he hired a van to remove the furniture and the sacks from the shop. It was all completed by the 10th. On December the 16th one of Edward's neighbours saw him digging a hole so deep they could only see the top of his head. Later they noticed the hole had been filled in. Edwards went on to dig another hole, and by the 23rd of December he had picked his next victim. Mr. Garland, who was a grocer in business at Victoria Park, had also advertised his shop for sale, and Edwards visited with a view to buying it. Mr. Garland went to the Church Road property to discuss the sale. We know how the rest went. Edwards was arrested and charged with taking the lives of the Darby family. At his trial at the Old Bailey before Mr. Justice Wright Edwards, he displayed the same cheek and callousness which he had shown at the station. Precautions, which had rarely been taken before, were considered necessary. No fewer than 8 warders surrounded him, and during the trial there was always 5 warders acting as guard over him. After the judge had taken his seat, Edwards was brought up from the cells. He wouldn't speak, so plea of not guilty was put on record. And once again a plea of insanity was used, but it was plain for all to see he was overacting the stupidity, and within 30 minutes the jury returned with a guilty response. When Edwards was asked if he had anything to say, he barked, "No, nothing, just get on with it." The judge put on the black cap, and Edwards bellowed, "This is like being on stage, Judge. Please just get on with it." Edgar Edwards was executed on March the 3rd, 1903, at Wandsworth. It was said that Edgar Edwards had walked unassisted to the scaffold and, although pale, had not faltered. The next one's an odd one. The Voice from the Grave case. In 1897, a widow named Anna Marie Druce declared that Mr. T.C. Druce, who in 1835 founded a large and prosperous upholstery business known as the Baker Street Bazaar, and the 5th Duke of Portland were one and the same person, and that in 1864 the Duke had destroyed his other personality by staging the fictitious death of Mr. T.C. Druce, held a bogus funeral and buried an empty coffin in a vault at Highgate Cemetery. In 1864 the passing of Mr. T.C. Druce was publicly announced, with the majority of his belongings being inherited by his son, Mr. Herbert Druce. As a result, Herbert took over as the owner of Baker Street Bazaar. It wasn't until 1897, 33 years later, that Mrs. Anna Marie Druce came forward and made the assertion that her deceased husband, Walter Druce, was actually the eldest son of T.C. Druce, who she claimed was also the 5th Duke of Portland. She pursued the goal of having the will invalidated. Initially, she approached the consistory court for the purpose of administering justice and successfully obtained an order to exhume the grave at Highgate. However, the High Court overturned this order after Mr. Herbert Druce, the owner of the grave, refused permission for exhumation. Undeterred, she continued with her legal battle, and in 1901 she brought an action in the probate court to have the will cancelled. At the court, 2 doctors and a nurse who looked after T.C. Druce gave evidence to prove that Mr. T.C. Druce had died in 1864 and had been buried at Highgate. When the nurse declared she had locked the door of the room that Mr. Druce lay in his coffin, Anna cried out, "Why did you lock the room up? To keep the devil out? What was in there? A corpse? A skeleton? What was in this wonderful Bluebeard chamber? An effigy? Ha ha! A wax figure? Ha ha! A face? Or what?" The court dismissed her action, pronounced for the will, and found as fact that Mr. T.C. Druce died in 1864. An obviously disturbed Anna Druce would later be certified as insane. But the case doesn't end there. George Hollamby Druce, an Australian bushman, comes into the picture, declaring that he was the grandson of Mr. T.C. Druce by the latter's first marriage, and that he was entitled to the dukedom and the ducal estates because Druce was the duke, and once again stated that the coffin buried at Highgate contained nothing but lead. This new claim came at the same time Anna had made hers. She became so angry about this claim, stating that he was just an absolutely ignorant impostor. He was, she declared, no relation of T.C. Druce, but only the grandson of a Bury St. Edmunds draper. In 1903, George Druce left his home in Australia and arrived in London to claim as the rightful heir of the 5th Duke of Portland. Bringing along his own solicitor, he managed to persuade people to help with his case and raised quite a large sum of money. He issued special appeals to the public for support, and he mentioned that he had witnesses to prove that T.C. Druce and the 5th Duke were one and the same person, that the Duke was married at Bury St. Edmunds in the name of Druce, that the funeral of Druce in 1864 was a sham, and that he, the claimant, was the direct heir to the dukedom and the estates. He told of the strange eccentricities the Duke allegedly had. He claimed the Duke's manner of travelling from Welbeck Abbey, the Duke's seat, to London was fantastical in the extreme. That after he became Duke in 1854, his servants had orders that his carriage was to be left overnight ready for travelling to London the next day. The next day the carriage wasn't to be checked inside to see if anyone was in it or not, but be driven to the station at Worksop, placed in a truck and taken to London, where servants was to drive it to Harcourt House, the Duke's own residence in Cavendish Square. He continued, "This absurd performance was repeated daily, sometimes the Duke being in the carriage and sometimes not. It was so constructed that it was impossible, without opening the doors, to know whether it was empty or occupied, and no servant would dare look." George Druce then told of the alleged disguises the Duke supposedly wore. As the Duke, he was clean-shaven, but in his character of Druce he wore a false wig, a false beard, and a false moustache. He built tunnels or underground passages at Welbeck Abbey, at Harcourt House, and even at the Baker Street Bazaar, all designed, George claimed, for the purpose of misleading his servants at Welbeck and his staff at Baker Street. By now he had enough support to be able to pay the legal fees. In 1907 he issued a summons against Mr. Herbert Druce, the owner of the bazaar, charging him with committing perjury in connection with the proceedings in the consistory court and the probate court. Both sides had very good counsel. The prosecution relied on an elderly gentleman named Robert Caldwell and two women, Miss Robinson and Mrs. Hamilton. They all swore that they had personally known the Duke as Druce. The police court proceedings lasted over 2 months, and during the whole of that time Scotland Yard held a watching brief. Chief Inspector Drew, who became well known for the Crippen case, and Savage, as well as other officers, were instructed to keep an eye on the various parties concerned. The court was to hear some quite amazing stories from the prosecution side. They went something like this. Robert Caldwell told how he met the Duke. He said he was 71 years old, was born in Ireland and went to the United States when he was a boy. He was formerly an accountant at Staten Island, Richmond, Virginia. In the early part of 1864 he came back to England because he wanted to be cured of a bulbous nose. He consulted Sir Morrel Mackenzie, who told him it was incurable. Then he went to India, where he met a British officer who cured him of his complaint and gave him the remedy. He came back to England and again saw Sir Morrel Mackenzie, and they both went to Welbeck, where Sir Morrel introduced him to the 5th Duke of Portland, who was, he said, suffering from a similar complaint. Caldwell cured the Duke, telling the court he did it in 60 days. Most of this time, he claimed, was spent at the Baker Street Bazaar. As a consequence, he became intimately acquainted with the Duke, who he knew adopted the name of Thomas Charles Druce. He told how they used to travel together in a peculiar carriage from Welbeck to Worksop, and then in another carriage which was placed on a waggon for London. When the carriage reached the railway terminus, there was a relay of horses to take it to Baker Street, where Caldwell himself had slept on various occasions. For curing the Duke, he received presents amounting to £15,000. According to Caldwell's story, it was he who arranged the mock funeral at the request of the Duke. He employed a carpenter near Baker Street to make the coffin. The carpenter delivered the coffin at the bazaar on December the 27th, 1864, and Caldwell put £200 of lead into it, and the lid was screwed down. He also ordered a hearse and 50 mourning coaches. The coffin was put in a hearse, the 50 mourning coaches were filled with old men and employees, the old men being paid 5 shillings each. The long procession moved off to Highgate Cemetery, where the interment took place. The Duke was not actually at the funeral, but he was at the bazaar supervising the arrangements. 2 days later, the Duke returned to Welbeck, and 2 months later, Caldwell returned to America. Caldwell went on to claim that the Duke wore a false beard and moustache when he went to the bazaar, and at times he put on his false beard when among his servants at Welbeck. One day he would have his breakfast with his whiskers, and another day without. Then came the next witness, Miss Mary Robinson, who lived at Clapham. She, like Caldwell, said she came from Virginia, where her father owned a plantation. She came to England in 1861 with relatives and servants, and she spoke not only about the Duke's dual role, but also of his friendship with Charles Dickens. She claimed to have kept diaries from 1861 to 1862, and also from 1868 to 1870. But unfortunately, these records, which would have corroborated her story, were all mysteriously stolen from her. She also complained that a number of original letters which Charles Dickens had written to her had also been stolen. She had made copies of the diaries, but the magistrate declined to allow them to be admitted, wanting her to rely on her memory. It was while staying at Tunbridge Wells, she said, that she was first introduced to Mr. T.C. Druce of Baker Street. In the summer they went together to Gad's Hill, and there she met Charles Dickens. Some time afterwards she left for America, and in 1868 her mother and she went to Boston, USA, where she again met Dickens, who then and there suggested that she should return to England and act as outside correspondent to Mr. Druce, who, said Dickens, lived at Welbeck Abbey. She was only 17 years of age, and she decided to come to England in October. She stayed at a hotel in Worksop. She went on. Charles Dickens was also there, and he took her and her mother for drives in the neighbourhood, including Welbeck Abbey, where they saw an underground tunnel. One day they met Mr. Druce in the park. At that time she did not know that Druce was supposed to be dead, nor did she know that Druce was really the Duke of Portland. Dickens introduced her to him as the little girl from America. Druce was then wearing blue spectacles and had no hair on his face. He engaged her as an outside correspondent at £100 a year, and in this capacity she used to receive a cover address to Madame Tussaud, and containing letters addressed to Mr. Druce. Her job was to forward the letters on to him. She continued. In May 1870, Dickens revealed the fact to her that Druce was actually the Duke of Portland, and when she repeated this story to Mr. Druce, he was first very annoyed, but later told her that he had confidence in her and would confess that he was the Duke of Portland. He explained that he had assumed the name of Druce because he had been married twice and had children by both wives, who were of low station. The last time she saw the Duke was in 1879, the year he died. On cross-examination, "Did you ever hear," she was asked, "before you came to this country, that Mr. Druce of the Baker Street Bazaar was supposed to have died in 1864? "I never heard it mentioned," she replied. "How came you to meet Mr. Dickens?" "My mother took me to his hotel in Boston when I was 17 years of age." "Do I understand that it was, at this first meeting, arranged that you were to come here and act as outside correspondent to Mr. Druce?" "Yes, Mr. Dickens was a friend of my mother." "Are you aware that it has been publicly announced by the Dickens family that Mr. Dickens had nothing to do with the Duke?" "No," she replied. There seemed to be an air of amusement and astonishment in the crowded courtroom, according to Savage, as he stood by. Next up, Mrs. Margaret Jane Lewis Hamilton. She said she was born in Rome in 1830, and that her father was Robert Lennox Stewart, who was connected with the family of General Scott, and that her father was a most intimate friend of the fourth Duke, who was a godfather. She claimed that she saw the fifth Duke at her father's house in Gower Street in 1864, and that he then told her of his intention to disappear. "Madge," he said, "I am going to die." She replied, "Well, you don't look like it." He said, "Oh, but I am," and her father remarked, "You must know he is going to cease to be Druce. He is going to have a funeral," and the Duke said, "I think we could get a corpse at either the workhouse or one of the hospitals." Her father disagreed with this idea. "Don't talk of such a thing," he said. "Put whatever you like in the coffin, but don't do that. Put in bricks, mortar, lead, or anything, but not a corpse." After the funeral she met the Duke and her father in Baker Street. "I thought you were dead and buried," she said to the Duke, who was apparently displeased at this reference to his death. He told her the funeral had cost him thousands of pounds in bribes to officials and others. She went on, claiming, on one occasion the Duke, who was in love with her, made a proposal of marriage, but she had declined. All these witnesses were subjected to a cross-examination as shattering in its effect as ever heard in a criminal court. The end was close, as Mr. Caldwell's statements had shown so many inconsistencies and inaccuracies that those prosecuting decided not to use his evidence, and Caldwell once the prosecution had closed, had already vanished quickly back to America so as not to be arrested for perjury. Once the prosecution had closed, Mr. Horace Avery addressed the magistrates on behalf of Mr. Herbert Druce. He said that Anna Marie Druce, who first put forward the fiction of the mock funeral, was now in a lunatic asylum, and it had been 42 years since the granting of probate of the will of Mr. T.C. Druce, and that Mr. Herbert Druce had, from the beginning, objected to having his father's grave desecrated. To satisfy a vulgar curiosity, or to satisfy the whim of a person who chose to make a claim to an estate in which Mr. Herbert Druce was not interested, and a claim which he knew to be untrue. If, however, in the interests of justice, required the grave to be opened, then Mr. Herbert Druce would consent to its being done in order to, once and for all, get rid of the story that there was lead in the coffin. The two doctors that attended T.C. Druce were now dead. Only the nurse, who was now 77, stood on the witness stand and once again told her side of the story, stressing that Mr. Druce had a natural beard and moustache. She also stated that his funeral was a small affair. On December the 30th, 1907, Professor Pepper and Sir Thomas Stevenson, the Home Office medical experts, Scotland Yard detectives and others went to Highgate Cemetery, and the family vault was opened. T.C. Druce's coffin was carefully opened, and in it was the body of Mr. T.C. Druce, in an excellent state of preservation. It was undeniable. Back at the court, the prosecution had no other option than to withdraw. The magistrate, Mr. Plowden, summed up. No one can doubt that Thomas Druce existed, in fact, and that he died in his own home in the midst of his family, and that he was buried in due course in the family vault at Highgate. His existence stands out as clear, as distinct, and as undeniable as that of any human being that ever lived. The case against Herbert Druce was dismissed. Proceedings against those that committed perjury would be held. Caldwell had escaped back to the US, but extradition charges were in play. But it came to nothing, as the unfortunate Mr. Caldwell died in an institution before this could happen. The two women, Mary Robinson and Mrs. Margaret Hamilton, were arrested in London and charged separately with committing perjury. Mary Robinson had made up the entire story. 66-year-old Mary Ann Webb was the daughter of James Webb, a Metropolitan Police Constable who had lived all his life at Wandsworth. It was in Wandsworth that she was born in 1841. She was married in 1865 to a butcher named William Robinson at Leeds Parish Church. She resided in Leeds until 1868. In the year she claimed to have met Dickens, she was with her husband, who was employed as a shepherd on the estate of the late Duke of Portland. In 1874, she and her husband and two children went to New Zealand, and 10 years later her husband died. Towards the end of 1906, while living in Christchurch, New Zealand, she saw in the newspapers references to the Druce-Portland case, and she got in touch with somebody in this country and was supplied with a pamphlet about the case. She made a full confession in Holloway Prison, where she claimed she had been offered £4,000 to write some things about the Duke. She then forged letters from Dickens and the Duke and concocted the story about the Duke, at the request of a man in Melbourne. She was tried at the Central Criminal Court before Mr. Justice Walton and was sentenced to penal servitude for 4 years in 1908. Mrs. Hamilton also told a false story. On May the 28th, at the age of 78, this highly imaginative old woman was sentenced to 18 months imprisonment with hard labour. Needless to say, George Hollamby Druce dropped his case. The Secret of the Locked Bag. Patrick Herbert Mahon was born in West Derby, Liverpool, in 1889. He married 23-year-old Jessie on the 6th of April 1910. Mahon was a womanizer, and a year into his marriage he had embarked on a weekend away with another woman to the Isle of Wight. This trip was paid for using forged cheques. Once the offence was discovered, he was bound over because it was his first offence. But it wasn't long before he would end up behind bars convicted of embezzlement. When he was released, he and his wife moved to Sunbury, but it wouldn't be long before he saw other women. In 1916, during a robbery, he was caught by a maidservant, but he turned on her and hit her over the head with a hammer. When caught, he was sentenced to 5 years. When released, his wife got him a job at the same firm she worked for, Console Automatic Aerators, where they sold soda fountains. When the company went bankrupt, the new owner, Mr. Hobbins, kept Mahon and his wife on, making Mahon his sales manager, where one of his duties was to visit the head office in Moorgate. On more than one occasion, when he visited places like Eastbourne or Hastings, he would telegram his wife that he couldn't make it back home due to work. She, knowing that he was a prolific womanizer, didn't trust his excuses at all. One day, while going through his pockets, she came across a cloakroom ticket for a bag which had been deposited at Waterloo Station. Her suspicions led her to ask the advice of a Mr. John Beard, who was formerly a divisional detective inspector in the Metropolitan Police. After hearing her concern, they went to the station together, where Beard handed over the ticket and received the bag. As the bag was locked, Beard prized open the sides, and inside he saw a large knife and blood-stained silk material. Without telling Mrs. Mahon of the contents, he gave the bag back to the ticket office and obtained a ticket, giving it back to Mrs. Mahon, and told her to return home and put the ticket back where she'd found it. John Beard then called Scotland Yard to tell them what he'd found. Savage was put on the case straight away, and he went promptly to Beard's house. After hearing what Beard had to say, Savage went straight to Waterloo Station and examined the bag. Obviously, the bag was still locked, but Savage managed to prise some of the blood-stained silk out of it. With a sample in his hand, he carefully took it to be examined by a specialist in Harley Street to ascertain if it was the blood of a human. After a quick test, the specialist concluded the blood was human. Savage went quickly back to Scotland Yard, where he told Detective Sergeants Frew and Thompson to go to Waterloo Station and keep a close watch on the cloakroom. They were instructed to detain the person who would collect the bag and bring them to Kennington Road Police Station. They had no idea how long this would take, but the detectives were under cover and waiting. And it didn't take long. At 6:15 p.m. the next evening, Mahon was caught red-handed claiming the bag at the ticket office and promptly escorted to Kennington Road Station, where Savage and Detective Inspector Hall would meet them. When Savage and J.I. Hall arrived around 9:30 p.m, Mahon was sitting in the waiting room, and he stood to greet Savage, stating that he had heard a lot about him. Savage and the D.I. took Mahon back to Scotland Yard, where Mahon sat silently while Savage unlocked the bag with the key that he had found in Mahon's pocket. Not a word was spoken as Savage took out the contents and placed them on the table in front of Mahon. A torn pair of silk bloomers, 2 pieces of new white silk, a blue silk scarf, all stained with blood and grease, and a large cook's knife. There was also a brown canvas racket bag with the initials EBK, and some disinfectant powder. When Savage asked if Mahon could account for the items, Mahon shrugged and said he was very fond of dogs, and maybe he had brought some dog meat back with him in the bag. Savage went on. Dog meat, but this is human blood. Mahon remained silent. You don't usually wrap dog meat up in silk, said Savage, stating he didn't believe his explanation. Staring straight at Savage, Mahon said, Dog's meat is dog's meat. Savage noticed Mahon becoming restless and had no doubt he was keeping a crime secret. But what was it? After an hour and a half, they still hadn't made much progress with Mahon, saying very little apart from quoting some Shakespeare at Savage. Time passed in silence, with just the sound of the ticking clock on the wall that was approaching midnight. Mahon suddenly stood up, breaking the silence, stating he would tell them the truth, as he believed they knew everything anyway. Savage cautioned him straight away. They all sat at the table where Inspector Hall took down in writing Mahon's 2.5-hour statement. A statement that shocked Savage to the core. Mahon's statement. He first met the woman in London about 10 months ago, when she was a clerk in the city. She had had several situations since then, her last being with a financial firm in Bond Street. On April the 12th, he continued, I met her at Eastbourne and we went to Langney Bungalow, which is just outside Eastbourne. I stayed with her until Thursday, April the 17th. On the previous day, Wednesday the 16th, we came to London to see some friends and posted some letters. We returned to Langney the same night. During that night, the 16th, we quarrelled over certain things, and in a violent temper she threw an axe at me. It was a coal axe. It hit me with a glancing blow. Then I saw red. We fought and struggled. She was a very big, strong girl. She appeared to be quite mad with anger and rage. During our struggle we overturned a chair, and her head fell on an iron coal scuttle, and it appeared, not more or less, to stun her. This happened at about 12 o'clock midnight. I attempted to revive her, but I found I could not. The reaction after the struggle having set in, the consequences to me came home with stunning force. I put the body in the spare room and covered it up with her fur coat. I came to London in the morning of April the 17th and returned to the bungalow fairly late, taking with me a knife which I had bought in a shop in Victoria Street. I also bought a small saw at the same shop. When I got back to the bungalow, I was still so upset and worried that I could not then carry out my intentions to decapitate the body. I did so on Good Friday. I severed the legs from the hips, the head, and left the arms on. I then put the various parts in a trunk in the bedroom and locked the door. On Saturday, April the 19th, I stayed at the bungalow, also Sunday the 20th, and came back to London on Monday the 21st. I did not touch the body either on Saturday, Sunday or Monday. I again went to the bungalow on Tuesday the 22nd, and on that day I burned the head in the sitting-room grate, and also the feet and legs. I came back to town late on Tuesday night or Wednesday morning. I went down again on Friday night, April the 25th, and stayed at a hotel that night, going over to the bungalow about 10 o'clock on Saturday morning. I had to cut up the trunk. I also had to cut the arms off. I burnt portions of them. The smell was appalling, and I had to think of some method of disposing of the portions. I then boiled some portions in the large pot in the bungalow. I cut the portions up small, packed them in a brown bag, and I threw them out the train while travelling between Waterloo and Richmond. These portions were not wrapped up in anything. This was about 10 o'clock on Sunday night. The bag to which I refer is the one now produced to me. I had intended to go home on Sunday night, but as I could not dispose of the portions between Waterloo and Richmond, I went on to Reading and stayed at the Station Hotel in the name of Rees. Next morning I came to London and left the bag in the cloakroom at Waterloo Station. I had disposed of the remaining pieces between Waterloo and Reading on April the 27th. The blood-stained cloth that was in the bag was a pair of bloomers that I got out of the girl's trunk. I tore them up and used it to wrap up some of the flesh. Savage realised throughout this that Mahon was under the impression that he knew who the woman was and where the bungalow was located. Of course, he let him continue. He just waited patiently while he thought and he talked. It wasn't until Mahon saw he had given enough information that he continued with the details Savage had been waiting for. The lady's name, Mahon went on, is Emily Bileby Kay, a single woman aged 29, an educated person, and when I first knew her 10 months ago was secretary to the receiver of the company where I was employed." Mahon paused for a moment before making a correction to his statement. He said the quarrel at the bungalow was not at midnight on April the 16th, but between 9 and 10 o'clock. "We had quarrelled on the way down from London," he explained. "At the time of the quarrel in the bungalow she had removed her fur coat and hat and was wearing a greenish-grey heather costume. All the clothing Miss K was wearing is now at the bungalow, including stockings and shoes. The 2 pieces of white silk were in Miss K's trunk and were used by me in wrapping up portions of the flesh. The powder in the bag is disinfectant, which I used because of the ghastly smell. It was about 6:15 today, May the 2nd, when I went to Waterloo and got my bag from the cloakroom, intending to go to Victoria and take it with me to the bungalow, as there were still some portions of the body remaining in the trunk. The cause of the quarrel occurred in this way. I had arranged with Miss K to do certain things, but my better nature prevailed. This appeared to inflame her, with the result that she threw a missile, which, although hitting me, did not injure me beyond a bruise. The rest followed as I have already said." Satisfied with this statement, he signed it at 2:30 a.m. 2 minutes later, Inspector Hall, Inspector McBride, the official photographer, and Savage were making their way to Eastbourne at top speed. Langley Bungalow was situated on a wild and desolate stretch of shingle known as the Crumbles. The officers walked up the path of the pretty little bungalow with roses adorning the doorway. On opening the door, the stench hit them. Looking around, they spotted the bones in the grates of the dining room and sitting room. The remains that had been boiled still sat in the pans. In a bedroom they found the blood-stained saw lying on the carpet and a trunk with the initials EBK on it. On opening it, they found the dismembered portions of a woman. They then found the heart and other internal organs in a biscuit tin. Bloodstains leading from the sitting room where the girl met her death showed that her body had been dragged across the hall into a bedroom, and from there taken into the scullery, where it was cut up before the remains were placed in the trunk. When Savage returned to London, he was told that Mahon wanted to change some points of his statement, stating he remembered the fight happening on the 15th, not the 16th, and that on the 16th he had met a Miss Duncan in London and had gone to Eastbourne on the following morning. Percy Savage didn't believe for 1 minute that Emily Kay had died due to an accident and charged Mahon with murder. To which he replied, "It is not murder, as my statement clearly shows." Savage contacted Sir Bernard Spilsbury, the pathologist who Savage greatly admired. The following morning, Sunday, Savage and Spilsbury went to the bungalow. Sir Bernard spent hours examining the dismembered and charred remains of Miss Kay. From the fire grates alone, they recovered no fewer than between 900 and 1,000 particles of burnt human bones. The head was missing, and although they searched the house thoroughly, they couldn't find it. But Mahon himself had said that he'd burnt it in the sitting-room grate. But as this was of a small old-fashioned type, Spilsbury and Savage were sceptical. They knew that if they could find the head, they could learn the exact nature of the blows which caused her death. Of one thing Sir Bernard was positive, was that no fall on the cauldron pot would have been severe enough to cause a fatal result. The only damage it had was a bent leg. Savage remembered some of the things that Mahon had mentioned in one of his statements, where he told how Miss Kay had wanted to see Mahon more, but he wasn't willing to do so. He claimed he liked her, but not as much as she did him. He went on to claim that he had given her about £100, a sum she had repaid, but had later asked for some of the money back, and he gave her about £30. The bungalow was her idea, Mahon claimed, so they could holiday together, and using the assumed name, Waller, was also her idea. Well, it would seem it was all her idea, eh? On the argument, he claimed it was because she wanted him to run away with her abroad, but he wouldn't give in to her. In his statement, he said, "This appeared to anger Miss Kay beyond endurance, and she suddenly picked up a weapon, a coal axe, and threw it at me. It struck me on the shoulder and glanced off and hit the door of the bedroom, breaking the shaft. We were then in the sitting room. I felt appalled at the fury she showed and realised suddenly how strong the girl was. She then ran at me and clutched at my face and neck. In sheer desperation and fright, I grabbed her, doing my best to fight back and loosen her hold. We struggled, and eventually in the course of the struggle we fell over an easy chair, and Miss Kay's head came in violent contact with a round iron cauldron. He tried to revive her, but realised she was dead." Mahon was desperately trying to convey himself as a gentleman who had been taken advantage of, but according to the inquiries of Savage, Hall and Sprackling, a rather different picture of Mahon was being portrayed, and it revealed Mahon as a cunning, vain and vicious murderer. They were soon able to establish the fact that 3 days before the alleged quarrel in the bungalow, he had not only definitely made up his mind to murder Miss Kay, but had actually bought the cook's knife and saw for the sole purpose of cutting up the body and disposing of it in sections. After talking to all of Miss Kay's close friends, they learned that she was a charming, happy 34-year-old woman who had a love of tennis. In June of 1923, she had moved to London, secured herself a good job, and unfortunately met Mahon. She had known he was married, but she had become very close to him, so much so she put all her trust in him and told him about her investments. And so we have a motive. Her bank account showed that within 2 months of her death, she had sold securities of the value of nearly £600, most of which she had given to Mahon, leaving herself with a balance of only £70. She gave Mahon £400 notes. 2 were cashed by Mahon at the Bank of England before her death, and 1 after her death. On each occasion he endorsed the notes with a false name and address. The 4th note was never traced. And then the ultimate motive came when Miss Emily Kay became pregnant by Mahon. She did suggest they left the country to start afresh, and to keep her quiet he agreed. With no intention of going away with her, he had taken most of her money, but with the pregnancy complicating things, he had to do something. So his plan of disposing of her came to fruition. On the 4th of April, he had rented the bungalow from April the 11th until June the 6th, under the name of Waller. Miss Kay then gave up her room at the residential club and went to live at a hotel at Eastbourne until the bungalow was ready. She took all her belongings, including a large trunk marked EBK and a hat box. 2 days before leaving, she had written to her married sister, stating that she was going abroad. She said she was engaged to a man named Pat Derrick Patterson, who was going to a post in South Africa, and wanted her to go with him. They would be married when they arrived there. She left London for Eastbourne on the 7th of April. 3 days later, on April the 10th, Mahon was walking through Richmond late at night when he met a young woman named Miss Ethel Duncan. They got into conversation. He said his name was Pat and that he was a married man. They walked towards Isleworth, where the girl lived. Before leaving her, he asked her whether she would dine with him, and she gave him her address. "You will probably be hearing from me next Wednesday," he said as he left. 2 days later, on the 12th, not the 17th as they had claimed, he walked into the shop on Victoria Street and bought the knife and saw. He then boarded a train to Eastbourne with the tools he had just bought. That night he met Miss Kay and they went by taxi to the bungalow. On the 14th, Emily wrote to her friend that she was moving abroad. A few hours later she would be dead and dismembered by the hands of Mahon. Within a few hours, Mahon had sent a telegram to Miss Duncan, Charing Cross, 7 tomorrow, sure, Pat. He made his way back to London and met Miss Duncan, and arranged for her to spend the Easter holiday with him at the bungalow in Eastbourne. She agreed, and on the 18th, Good Friday, she caught the train to Eastbourne, where she met Mahon. They spent the afternoon together before heading to the bungalow. They spent the night together, while Miss Kay lay dead in a trunk in the next room. The next day he spent the day at the races, where he used the last £100 he'd taken from Emily Kay. Now he needed to be rid of Miss Duncan to carry on with his plans, so he sent himself a telegram making it seem like he had to be back in London by Bank Holiday Monday. He parted with Miss Duncan at Richmond the next day at around midnight. From there he travelled back and forth from London to Eastbourne, disposing of body parts along the way. On Tuesday he burnt her head, then crushed the skull into dust and threw it over the wall into the shingle. Over the next coming days he travelled, disposing of the body parts, and on the 27th he was returning from Eastbourne, getting rid of more parts along the way, when he left the bag at the cloakroom, intending to pick it up again to carry on the job of disposal, when he was stopped by the police. How was she killed? Well, without the head it was difficult for them to say, but after a reconstruction of the events that night, they were confident that Mahon had struck Emily on the head with an axe as she was passing through the doorway of the sitting room to the bedroom. The trial at Lewes Assizes was held on July the 15th, 1924, and it lasted for 5 days. Mahon stood confidently in the dock, dressed impeccably in a smart blue suit. His tanned complexion had a weathered quality that hinted at a life well lived, catching the attention of the officers, who wondered if he had applied nicotine water to enhance his rugged appearance. He boldly proclaimed he was not guilty. At the end of the 5-day trial, the jury took 3/4 of an hour to find Mahon guilty and sentenced to hang. He appealed, but it was dismissed. Mahon was hanged on September the 3rd, 1924, at Wandsworth Prison by Thomas Pierpoint. Chief Superintendent Percy William Savage retired in 1934 and would pass away in 1943 at the age of 64 at Maidencombe near Torquay. He was described as one of the greatest detectives ever to serve at Scotland Yard. Thank you for watching.